Welcome back to Bust Big Pharma. I'm Rob Burgess, and today, folks, we're going to talk about a scam hiding in plain sight. One drug, one molecule, and 154 patents. That's not a typo. You didn't mishear me. 154. Now that you've heard that number, your first reaction was probably the right one. How the hell does one drug end up with 154 patents? Seriously. Did Novo Nordisk invent 154 different medicines? Did they discover 154 different miracle cures for something? Of course not. And that's exactly the point. See, most normal people think that they understand what a patent is. You invent something new. You take the risk. You spend the money. You make the breakthrough. And the government says, great, fine. Here's a period of time where nobody else can rip you off and copy it, and you're allowed to make some money. That's the reward for innovation. That's the deal. And that's the way it's supposed to work. But, and this is a huge part of Big Pharma and a part that Big Pharma never wants us to dwell on, that protection is supposed to be temporary. Temporary. It's not forever. Eventually, the patent is supposed to expire. Competition is supposed to show up, and generic drugs are supposed to enter the marketplace. Prices come down. Patients finally catch a break. That's the bargain. Innovation first. Competition later. Lower prices eventually. That's the theory. It's a theory that we have operated on and believed to have existed for decades. Now, let me tell you what actually happens. What actually happens is Big Pharma takes that system, twists it, stretches it, exploits every loophole in sight, and turns what was supposed to be a temporary protection into a long-term money-making machine. And right now, there may not be a better example of that anywhere in America than Ozempic. You know the drug. Everybody knows the drug, and we've seen those commercials. We've heard the celebrity chatter, and we've seen the social media hype. We've probably even watched people talk about these injections like they're a second coming of modern medicine. Ozempic, Wegovy, GLP-1s. These things have exploded. Doctors are prescribing them everywhere, and patients are asking for them by name, thanks to the billions of dollars spent on direct-to-consumer advertising. And the companies behind those ads and the companies behind these drugs are making a fortune, an absolute fortune. But behind all the hype, behind all the glossy headlines, behind all the breathless media coverage, there is a part of the story that the average American never hears. Because while people are shelling out thousands of dollars a year for these drugs, the company behind Ozempic has built a legal fortress around it. A fortress made of 154 patents. Now think about that. A single drug, a single molecule with 154 different protections around it. You do not need to be a lawyer or a scientist, and you don't need to be some K Street health policy consultant in Washington, D.C. to hear that and know immediately that something smells rotten, because it does. And here's the game. They didn't create 154 different medicines. What they did was something that Big Pharma has gotten very, very good at. They've built what researchers call a patent thicket, and that's exactly what it sounds like. A legal jungle, a maze, a wall, a barrier designed to keep competitors trapped on the outside while the company inside keeps charging whatever it wants. And here's why that matters. Ozempic should already be getting closer to the point where cheaper competition can show up in the market. Again, that's how it was supposed to work. That's the entire point of a patent system. You get rewarded for your innovation, you get your window of protection, and then you have to compete in a free and fair market. And that's when prices finally start to come down. But thanks to this patent thicket, cheaper generic competition may not arrive until 2031 at the earliest. That means years more of monopoly pricing, years more of just a few companies controlling the market, and years more of Americans paying top dollar. And those extra years are not just some accounting footnote. They're worth an estimated $166 billion to the manufacturer. Let that sit with you. A strategy built around patent filings is worth $166 billion. Now, folks, this is the part where Big Pharma always wants you to know they put on the white coat and act noble. They say, well, innovation's expensive. They love to say, we need to protect research. And they absolutely don't mind beating their chest when they say this is all about finding the next breakthrough. And let me be clear, real innovation should continue to be rewarded. And of course, it should. Medical breakthroughs matter. They save lives, they improve lives, and nobody serious is arguing otherwise. But this is something else. This is not protecting innovation. This is protecting revenue. This is protecting a monopoly. This is protecting a cash cow. And there's a big difference between rewarding a discovery and rigging the system so that competition gets shoved further and further and further down the road. And that is what this is really about. And don't think for a second that it's just Ozempic. It's not. Ozempic is the example I'm using today. Ozempic is the case study. Ozempic is the one drug that makes the whole racket easy to see because this is a playbook. Big Pharma has been doing this for years. You get the original patent. Then before it runs out, you start filing more on top of it. On the device, one on the formula, one on the manufacturing process, and then on the dosage, and then on the packaging, and then one on the delivery system, and then another one after another one after another one after another one. Until eventually anybody who wants to compete is staring at such a dense, expensive, time-consuming legal maze that they either give up or get buried. And that's the whole point. The longer competition stays out, the longer prices stay high. The longer prices stay high, the longer the money keeps rolling in. That's Big Pharma's business model. That's the game. And the American people are the ones paying for it. So yes, this is an episode about Ozempic. But more than that, this episode is about how Big Pharma has gamed the system. It's about how something that was supposed to be temporary gets turned into something that feels almost permanent. And it's about how Americans wind up paying monopoly prices for years longer than they ever should. And it's about why more and more people, including policymakers, including President Trump and his team, are finally starting to say enough is enough. Because Americans should not be paying the highest drug prices in the world while everybody else gets a discount. And they sure as hell should not be paying those prices longer than necessary because pharmaceutical companies figured out how to turn the patent system into a billion-dollar shield. So today we're going to pull this thing apart. We're going to talk about the money. We're going to talk about the strategy. We're going to talk about how the market got this distorted. And we're going to talk about why this issue matters to every single American who has ever stood at a pharmacy counter and wondered, why is this bill so damn high? So buckle up. Because once you see how this game is played, you start seeing it everywhere. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. This is Bust Big Pharma. Now, before we get into the mechanics of how this system gets manipulated, and trust me, we're going to get there, we need to understand something first. We need to understand why the stakes are so high. Because Ozempic didn't just become a household name by accident. This drug sits right in the middle of one of the most valuable pharmaceutical markets in modern history. And when that kind of money is on the table, companies will fight like hell to protect it. So let's talk about what actually happened here. Ozempic and other drugs like Wegovy belong to a class of drugs called GLP-1 medications. And originally, these drugs were developed to treat type 2 diabetes. They help regulate blood sugar. They slow digestion. They help the body control insulin. All very important things for people managing diabetes. But then something interesting started happening. Doctors began noticing something else. Patients weren't just stabilizing their blood sugar, they were losing weight, and not a little weight, not 5 pounds, not 10 pounds, but people were losing 20, 30, 40 or more. Now stop and think about that for a minute. We live in a country where more than 40% of adults struggle with obesity. And millions of Americans have tried everything: diets, exercise programs, supplements, medications, infomercial cures, and still struggle to lose weight. And suddenly, here comes a drug that helps people lose serious weight while also improving their metabolic health. That's not just another diabetes treatment anymore. It's a cultural phenomenon. And that's exactly what happened. Ozempic, Wegovy, GLP-1 drugs as a whole, they exploded into the public consciousness almost overnight. Celebrities started talking about them. Influencers started posting about them. Television segments started covering them. And suddenly, patients were walking into doctors' offices saying something very simple. Hey, doc, can I get Ozempic? Now put yourself in the shoes of the pharmaceutical companies watching all of this unfold. You realize you're not just selling a diabetes drug anymore. You're sitting on the foundation of an entirely new market, a massive market, and not small massive. We are talking gigantic. We are talking exceeding $100 billion a year within the next decade. That's larger than the entire global market for many other types of medications. It's larger than the GDP of some countries. And right now, only a handful of companies control the space. Novo Nordisk, Eli Lilly, a few others are trying to catch up. But here's the thing that really tells you how big this moment is. The demand has been so intense that manufacturers have actually struggled to keep up. I'm sure you've seen the headlines. I've seen them. Drug shortages, wait lists, pharmacies running out of stock, doctors trying to ration prescriptions. That doesn't happen very often in the pharmaceutical industry. Shortages usually mean something unexpected has happened. And that's exactly what happened here. Because once word got out about how effective these drugs could be for weight loss, demand didn't just increase, it exploded. Now, here's where the economists start to matter. Because in most markets, and this is basic economics, competition drives prices down. When multiple companies produce the same product, they compete. They compete on price, they compete on access, they compete on availability, and they compete for consumers' benefit. When a small number of companies dominate a high demand market, something very different happens. Prices stay high, margins stay high, revenue grows, and the companies controlling the market work very hard to keep it that way. Look at the price of these drugs in the United States. Depending on your insurance coverage, patients can pay $900 to $1,300 a month for medications like Ozempic or Wegovy. For people paying out of pocket, that can easily exceed $15,000 a year. $15,000 a year for a single medication. Now imagine what happens if suddenly 5 or 6 different manufacturers start producing competing versions of that same drug. Prices start falling, sometimes dramatically. And we've seen this play out across the pharmaceutical industry for decades. Once real competition enters a market, prices can drop 50%, 70%, sometimes even 90% over time. That's what competition does, and it's healthy. And that's exactly what companies want to avoid when they're sitting on a product generating billions of dollars in revenue. Because when you're at the center of a market projected to reach $100 billion a year, every percentage point of price matters. Every month of market control matters. Every year without serious competition can mean billions of dollars in additional revenue. That's why companies invest so aggressively in protecting their positions. Because when you have a drug that patients desperately want, doctors are prescribing it everywhere, and demand that keeps growing, you're sitting on what businesses call a cash cow, a product that prints money. And when companies have a cash cow like that, they do everything they can to keep it producing. They expand manufacturing. They ramp up marketing. They build brand recognition. They build relationships with prescribers. And most importantly, they work very, very hard to make sure competitors don't suddenly show up and start undercutting the price. Because once real competition enters a market like this, the economics change really fast. Margins shrink, pricing power weakens, and the extraordinary profits start coming back down to earth. That's why the GLP-1 market has become one of the most fiercely defended territories in the pharmaceutical industry right now. The demand is massive. The patient population is enormous. The revenue potential is staggering. And the companies that got there first have every incentive to protect their advantage for as long as possible. Now, let me be clear about something. Companies competing aggressively in a market is not illegal. That's business. That's capitalism. And when the stakes reach this level, when you're talking about a $100 billion industry, the strategies companies use to protect their positions start getting a lot more creative. They get a lot more aggressive, and sometimes they get a lot more questionable. And that brings us to the real heart of this story. Because when you start looking at how companies defend their dominance in markets like this, you start to see how a system that was originally designed to reward innovation can sometimes be turned into something very different. And once you understand that strategy, once you see how it works, you start realizing something important. Ozempic isn't the exception. It's the example. Because the same playbook is used across the entire pharmaceutical industry. And the name for that playbook is something most Americans have never heard of before. It's called evergreening, or a patent thicket. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack. So now we're at the part of the story that most Americans don't know a lot about. And that's why we're going to pull the curtain back. This is where we get into the mechanism of maintaining market position for Big Pharma, their strategy, their playbook. Because earlier we talked about the explosion of GLP-1s. We talked about the demand. We talked about shortages. We talked about the billions of dollars pouring into the space. And we talked about why companies are desperate to hold on to that advantage. But once you understand how big the money is, the next question becomes extremely obvious. How do we protect it? How do you keep competitors out of a market this valuable? How do you keep the cash cow producing year after year after year? Well, the answer starts with something most Americans have heard about, but very few actually understand: the patent system. Now, remember the basic deal. You invent something. You develop a new drug. You take financial risk. You spend years, sometimes decades, working on a breakthrough. And the government says, all right, if you succeed, you get a patent. That patent gives you protection. It gives you a period of time when nobody else can copy your invention. That's the reward for your innovation. That's the deal. And on paper, it makes sense. But the part that most people don't realize is that the 20-year patent clock starts ticking when the patent is filed. Not when the drug reaches patients, not when the drug hits pharmacy shelves, but when the patent is filed. And developing a new drug takes a long time. Clinical trials, safety testing, regulatory approval, manufacturing, distribution, all of that can take 10 years or more. So by the time a new medicine finally reaches the market, a big chunk of that 20-year protection window is already gone, which means the company has far less time to sell the drug without competition. Now put yourself in the shoes of a pharmaceutical executive. You've spent billions developing a drug. You finally bring it to market. Demand is exploding. The revenue's pouring in, but you know something else is coming. You know that eventually the clock runs out. Eventually, competitors start to show up, and eventually generic versions of your innovation start driving the price down. So then the question becomes, how do we extend the clock? How do we keep this product protected longer? And this is where the strategy of evergreening comes in, or like I told you earlier, policy experts call it a patent thicket. And once you understand how those work, you start seeing them everywhere. So here's the playbook. Instead of relying on just one patent protecting the original discovery, companies start stacking additional patents around every possible aspect of the drug: the delivery device, the injection pen, the dosage, the chemical formulation, the manufacturing process, the storage method, the packaging, the administration method. One patent, then another, then another, then another, then another, then another, each one covering a slightly different piece of the product. So here's the key. Most of those patents are not protecting a brand new medicine. They're protecting tweaks, adjustments, or variations. And when you stack them all together, something powerful happens. You create a legal maze, a maze that competitors have to navigate if they ever want to bring a competing product to market. And navigating that maze is incredibly difficult because every single one of those patents becomes a potential legal obstacle. If a competitor tries to launch a competing drug, they don't just have to deal with one patent. They might have to challenge dozens of them. Each challenge can take years. Each challenge costs millions of dollars. Each challenge requires teams of lawyers, scientists, and regulatory experts. And even if the competitor eventually wins, the delay itself can keep them out of the market for a long time. Now remember the number we talked about earlier, 154. That's how many patents researchers have identified surrounding semaglutide and the drugs built around them. 154. Now think about what that means if you're a competitor. You're not dealing with one legal barrier. You're dealing with a wall, a web, a thicket of overlapping protections. And every one of those protections can slow you down. That's why the term patent thicket exists, because that's exactly what it is. It's dense. It's complicated. It's extremely difficult to fight your way through. Now, of course, pharmaceutical companies will say these additional patents represent legitimate improvements. Sometimes they do. Sometimes a new injection device really does make the drug easier to use. Sometimes a reformulation really does improve shelf life. Those improvements can matter. But here's the question policymakers are starting to ask. At what point does protecting innovation become protecting monopoly revenue? Because when one drug ends up surrounded by more than 100 patents, the question becomes unavoidable. Are we protecting scientific discovery or are we protecting a market? And this isn't just happening with Ozempic. I told you that earlier. Researchers studying pharmaceutical patents have found the same pattern again and again and again across blockbuster drugs. A breakthrough discovery followed by years of additional patents, followed by delayed competition, followed by extended monopolistic pricing. The original patent protects the innovation, but the layers that have come afterward serve a different purpose. They extend timelines and they push competition further, and further away. And every year without competitors means the company controlling the drugs keeps dominating the market and putting more and more revenue into their pocket. This is a market projected to exceed $100 billion a year. Monthly prices reaching $1,000 or more. Demand that continues to grow. And if you're sitting on a product generating that kind of revenue, don't you have a pretty strong incentive to protect it? And that's exactly what we're seeing. Companies are using every tool available to extend their advantage. But here's the thing. None of it's hidden. The patents are public, the filings are documented, and the strategy is well understood inside the big pharma industry. For most Americans, it's invisible. Patients see the price at the pharmacy counter. They don't see the legal structure protecting it. They see the monthly bill. They don't see the web of patents keeping competitors out. And it's why stories like this, podcasts like this matter. Because once you understand how a patent thicket works, you start seeing how a system designed to reward innovation can also be used to delay competition and delay the moment when prices finally start to fall, which brings us to the next part of the story. Because policymakers have started noticing what's happening, and they've started asking whether the rules are working the way they were originally intended, or do they need to find a way to push back? And one of the biggest ideas at doing that is called most favored nation pricing. So let's zoom out for a second, because everything we've talked about today, the explosive demand, the massive market, the strategies companies use to protect their advantage, all of it leads to one unavoidable reality. Americans pay the highest drug prices in the world. Not sometimes, not occasionally, almost always. And that's not some weird coincidence. That's not bad luck. That's the result of a system that has allowed pharmaceutical companies to charge whatever the American market will tolerate while selling the exact same drug overseas for far less. I'm going to repeat that. The exact same drug, the same pill, the same injection, often made in the same manufacturing plant, but Americans paid dramatically more. Now, folks, if you're sitting there listening to this as American patients, the obvious question that we should ask is why? Why are Americans paying more than anyone else? Why are families having to carry the biggest financial burden while patients in Europe and Canada and other developed countries pay a fraction of the price for the same medication? Well, the answer is uncomfortable. For decades, the United States has essentially been subsidizing the rest of the world's drug price. And other countries negotiate aggressively to make sure that this stays the same. That's the truth. They set price limits. They refuse to pay for certain medicines at certain rates. Their governments sit down with pharmaceutical companies and say, here's what we're willing to pay, take it or leave it. And pharmaceutical companies accept those lower prices overseas for a very simple reason. They know where the real money is. It's in America. The United States has historically been the one place where pharmaceutical companies can charge the most. And when you're talking about the largest pharmaceutical market on earth, the most profitable healthcare system in the world, that becomes the anchor for the entire global business model. Sell cheaper overseas, make up the difference in the United States. That's their formula. That's their math. And for a long time, Washington basically allowed it. But eventually, policymakers started asking a question that, quite frankly, should have been asked a long time ago. If Americans are funding so much of the global pharmaceutical market, why are we the ones paying the most? Why should American families pay 2, 3, sometimes 4 times more than patients in other developed countries for the exact same drug? That question led to an idea that sounds complicated, but it's actually very simple, and we can thank President Trump for implementing it. It's most favored nation pricing. Now, don't let the name scare you. The concept's incredibly straightforward. Under a most favored nation policy, the United States will no longer allow pharmaceutical companies to charge Americans more than they charge other comparable countries. In other words, if a drug company is selling a medication in Germany for a certain price, if they're selling it in France for a certain price, if they're selling it in Canada for a certain price, then they shouldn't be able to turn around and charge Americans 2, 3, or 4 times more for the exact same drug. Because American patients are not the world's ATM. And that's the exact idea that President Trump's administration has begun pushing. President Trump has looked at this system and said something that, frankly, millions of Americans were already thinking. Why are we paying more? Why are we getting the worst deal? He pointed something out that Americans instinctively understood, that we're being taken advantage of. And his administration began developing policies designed to change that. The most favored nation proposal was one of the most aggressive attempts to tackle that imbalance head on. The idea was simple. Tie the price Americans pay for certain drugs to the lowest prices paid in other developed countries. If pharmaceutical companies want access to the American market, and they do, trust me, it's the biggest and most profitable pharmaceutical market on the planet, then they should stop charging Americans dramatically more than anybody else. Now, you can probably guess what happened next. Big Pharma went ballistic. They fought the idea very hard. They said it would hurt innovation. They said it would disrupt the market. They said it would threaten research and development. They made so many threats that they turned into talking points. And those talking points almost felt like reality, but it's not. Here's the reality. Drug companies already sell these medications overseas at lower prices. They're lying to us. They already operate under systems where governments negotiate aggressively. We're not doing anything new. They already make those markets work for them. We're not going to put them out of business here in America. The only place where we've been able to consistently charge the highest prices in the world is right here in the United States. And that's why the idea of most favored nation pricing rattled them, because it threatened the one market where they've historically had the most pricing power. Now let's connect this back to the story I've been talking about today. When companies control a massive market like the GLP-1 space, when demand is exploding, when prices remain sky high, they have an enormous incentive to protect that pricing power. And every extra year of high prices can mean billions of dollars in additional revenue. That's why strategies that extend market control are so valuable to Big Pharma. But policies like most favored nation pricing begin to change the math. They introduce a simple principle. If you're selling a drug around the world for X, Americans shouldn't be the ones paying Y. And that idea resonates with a lot of people. Republicans, Democrats, Independents, because regardless of political party, most Americans agree on one thing. We shouldn't be subsidizing the rest of the world's healthcare systems. We shouldn't be paying the highest prices for medications that were developed with enormous contributions from American research institutions, American universities, and American taxpayers. That's why the conversation around drug pricing has started to shift. More policymakers are asking tougher questions. More proposals are emerging to address the imbalance. And the concept behind most favored nation pricing remains one of the clearest ways to move the system towards something that looks a little bit more like fairness. Now, let's be honest. No single policy is going to fix everything overnight. The pharmaceutical marketplace is complicated. The economics are complex, but forcing price parity with other developed countries would be a significant step in the right direction because it would finally begin addressing one of the most frustrating realities in American healthcare. The fact that the country leading the world in pharmaceutical innovation is also the country where patients often pay the most for medicines they need is ridiculous. And that's a system that more and more Americans are starting to question, which brings us to the final piece of today's conversation. Because stories like the one we've been talking about today, the strategies, the pricing, the dynamics, the policies, they're all part of a much bigger picture. And once you start looking at that bigger picture, you realize there are a lot of things happening in this system that most Americans have never been told about. And that's exactly why conversations like this matter. So let's take a step back and look at the big picture of what we've been talking about today. Because it all started with a number that should make every American stop and think. 154 patents. That's how many patents have been identified surrounding a single drug. One molecule. Semaglutide. The ingredient behind Ozempic and Wegovy. One drug. One molecule. 154 patents. The number tells you something. It tells you something about how the pharmaceutical game is played in this country because the story isn't Ozempic. It's not one company. It's the system. We've talked about the explosion of the GLP-1 market, and market analysts believe that it could exceed $100 billion a year in the near future. This is not niche therapy. That's not small pharmaceutical categories. That's a financial earthquake. Patients want these drugs. Doctors are prescribing these drugs. And the companies that got to market first are the ones sitting on the most profitable opportunities the pharmaceutical industry has seen in decades. And then we talked about what happens when that kind of money's on the table. Companies fight to protect it. They build strategies. They create barriers. They extend timelines because every year without competition means prices stay high. And every year those prices stay high means billions of dollars continuing to flow into companies that control the market. And then we talked about something that should frustrate every single one of you listening to this show. The fact that Americans pay the highest drug prices in the world. Not because the drugs are different, not because they cost more to manufacture here than somewhere else, but because for decades, the United States has been the one market where pharmaceutical companies could charge the most. Sell cheaper overseas. Make it up in America. That's been the formula. And that's exactly why ideas like most favored nation pricing started gaining traction. Because eventually Americans started asking the obvious question. Why are we paying the most? Why should American families carry the heaviest burden while the rest of the developed world pays less for the same medicine? Now, here's the thing. The more you start asking those questions, the more you start pulling on those threads, the more you realize how many parts of the pharmaceutical system operate in ways most Americans never see. Most people only see the pharmacy counter. They see the price tag. They see the monthly bill. What they don't see is everything that happens behind the curtain. The legal strategies, the pricing structures, the market protections, the policy decisions, all the machinery that ultimately determines what Americans pay for the medicines they need. And that's exactly why this podcast exists. Bust Big Pharma is about lifting up those rocks. Because when you start lifting up rocks in the pharmaceutical industry, you discover something pretty quickly. There's a lot underneath them. A lot of strategies, a lot of policies, a lot of decisions that shape the system in ways most Americans never hear about. Now, look, none of this means the pharmaceutical industry hasn't done extraordinary things. Modern medicine has changed the world. Breakthrough therapies have saved millions of lives. Innovation truly does matter, but innovation should never become a shield that protects every business practice from scrutiny. And it certainly shouldn't be used as an excuse for a system where Americans routinely pay the highest prices in the world. If the system is working the way it was designed, it should stand up to examination. But if parts of that system have been bent or stretched or quietly manipulated over time, then the American people deserve to know about it. And that's exactly what we're going to keep doing here. We're going to keep asking questions. We're going to keep digging into the policies, the strategies, and the incentives that shape drug prices in this country. We're going to keep lifting up the rocks, because once you start shining light on how the system actually works, something interesting happens. People start asking better questions. Policymakers start paying closer attention, and the parts of the system that rely on complexity and secrecy suddenly get a lot harder to defend. That's the goal. Transparency, accountability, and a conversation about how we make the system work better for the people it's supposed to serve. The patients, the families, the Americans who rely on these medicines every single day. So if today's episode got you thinking, if it made you wonder how many other drugs might be surrounded by the same kinds of protections, if it made you curious about what else is happening behind the scenes in the pharmaceutical industry, then stick with us, because we're just getting started. And there are a lot more rocks for us to turn over, a lot more stories for us to share, and a lot more parts of this system that deserve a closer look. This is Bust Big Pharma, and I'm Rob Burgess. We'll see you next time.